Ever since the beginning of horror filmmaking, the genre has continuously given birth to numerous horror icons. What all began with characters as classic as the universal monsters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman, what made an icon in horror filmmaking evolved over time alongside the genre itself. This evolution continued all the way through to the 60s, giving birth to icons like Norman Bates, carrying all the way into what many consider to be, still today, the golden age of horror and the golden age of horror icons, and that's the 70s and the 80s. It was in that era that the kings of horror, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, all drew their first drop of blood from their victims. And while not being quite as popular as that big three, that era also gave birth to numerous icons who are also considered to be A-list, like Leatherface, Chucky, Pinhead, so many awesome characters, all given birth to in this era. But unfortunately, like the saying says, all good things must come to an end. The late 80s into the 90s marked very dark times for our favorite horror icons. You had Freddy Krueger invading the dreams of an infant as well as the dreams of his long-lost daughter. Jason takes a vacation to Manhattan, New York, and then an express ticket all the way down to hell. And Michael Myers plays around with a thorn curse and a man in black. So many wild different directions, so many wild different storylines, so many wild decisions made for the directions of these iconic characters, but what they all have in common is that they started a slow and painful death for not only the slasher genre, but for the love and the appreciation that fans of horror had for those characters at the time. While in the 1990s, when the slasher genre was just beginning to flatline with fans and critics alike, horror kept its heart going by taking a left turn and going a completely different direction and going into completely unventured territory, which is a topic we're going to dive into more later on this month. But lucky for us fans, just like these iconic horror characters in every single one of their sequels, the slasher genre refused to die. In 1996, the slasher genre was reinvented and taken by storm by one singular voice. 1 second, sorry. Hello?
You like scary movies?
You're goddamn right I do. But while Ghostface was taking the money and running, a few directors actually thought, you know what? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And we're going to go back and we're going to try to just stick to the tried and true formula that made these icons in the 70s and 80s great, with some new characters and breathe some new life into the genre ourselves. But were they successful? Somewhat. And so we have the B-team of slasher horror. 1992 saw the release of Candyman, played by the great Tony Todd, directed by Bernard Rose, and based on a short story called The Forgotten by none other than Clive Barker. Yes, the father of Pinhead also gave birth to Candyman. And what made Candyman such a success in the 90s was not only the fact that the filmmakers went back to the tried and true method of birthing a horror character out of an urban legend, but also by the iconic performance of Tony Todd as Candyman. This guy nowadays is synonymous with horror movies. He's got franchises like Final Destination, he's a big character in the Hatchet films, all because of his character and his performance of Candyman. And Candyman is such a wild, brutal, and scary-ass character. This guy's got a hook for a hand, he's got a family of honeybees. You better fucking run.
Candyman, she turned out the lights.
Now, despite the fact that you got an actor with the screen presence of Tony Todd, what also made Candyman an instant icon in the 90s was not only the brutality and the gore and the extremity of his kills, but how brutal his backstory and his origin is. It's kind of a rule in horror. As much carnage as we love to watch these icons rain upon all of the teenagers and the adult victims that they prey through in all of their movies, the gorier and the more sinister their backstory and the more evil that they endure before they actually become that evil character, the better. And just a year later, we gave birth to probably the most successful of any of these franchises as far as the number of sequels that this character has gotten. It's almost ridiculous how many movies this character has gotten. Leprechaun, baby! 1993 births Warwick Davis's horror icon, the first movie being directed by Mark Jones and giving the first acting performance of the great and beautiful Jennifer Aniston. You have this very simple setup in Leprechaun that proved to be a success. And the method used to success in Leprechaun was taking a character that is all over pop culture for kids and adults alike, and you put a horror, evil spin on that character's lore. You have a leprechaun where if somebody takes any of his gold coins, that is marked for death, and he is coming for you with everything that he has, even if it comes in small packages.
This old left, he played one. He played pogo on his lawn.
And Leprechaun was such a success that for the next 3 years, we got a yearly Leprechaun movie. This guy has had so much fun. He got to go all the way to Vegas. He even got to go to space in one of his movies. Come to think of it, maybe we should blame this little fucker for Jason X. Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the Leprechaun films are bathed in B-movie cheese, to the point where they're really unappealing to a lot of people, and yet they still were such a huge success, and they were such a big franchise, and they gave birth to definitively an icon of the 90s, and really it's all because of the fun and the charm of that evil little bastard played by Warwick Davis.
A friend with weed is a friend indeed. But a friend with gold is the best, I'm told.
One-liners go a long way, people, and as if things weren't wild enough already, horror filmmakers took it even farther into mysticism, magic, special effects, laden kills with Wishmaster in 1997. Directed by Robert Kurtzman and produced by the great Wes Craven, Wishmaster gave birth to the Djinn. This is a magical genie. Not that magical genie. The Djinn was a wish-granting evil entity that's trying to gather up enough human souls to release his Djinn brethren upon Earth.
The universe is mine to command, to control!
Okay, that's enough of that shit. And while Candyman had us covered on the urban legend, brutal kills, while Leprechaun had us covered on all the iconic one-liners, Wishmaster took hold of the element of slasher horror, being the demonic side.
I am the cry of the abandoned child, the winter of the whipped geese. Oops, Alexandra.
Hellfire, torture, gore, tons of pain. That is what this guy is. He is despair.
I am despair.
But if all that shit was too much for you, have no fear, because the same year gave birth to another icon dubbed the Fisherman, or Ben Willis, or the Slicker Killer, whatever the fuck you want to call him. I know what you did last summer, that guy. Taking its cues from Scream's success, also borrowing the same screenwriter in Kevin Williamson in a script that was actually rejected until Scream took off, directed by Jim Gillespie, this first film was probably the most successful slasher film after Scream in the 1990s. It has a lot of the same elements, a lot of the same methods, and it's probably still to date the one that people go back and watch the most next to the Scream franchise. And you have an awesome killer in the name of Ben Willis, or the Fisherman, or the Slicker Killer. And what was great about this guy was that he wasn't a demon, he wasn't an urban legend, he wasn't a folklore character trying to tip his hat to the evil side. He's just a man on a hunt for vengeance. And holy shit does he mean business. This was one of those times when what made a character iconic was honestly just the look, just the simplistic look of a fisherman and a black slicker holding a hook. I mean, it doesn't get more simplistic than that, and yet, especially at the time, it was so freaking scary. Just to imagine this guy chasing you in the rain, in the dark. No thank you. But while these characters all experienced success in various amounts, they all spawned franchises in various lengths, they definitely were icons of the 90s, they never quite reached the status of Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, or even the character that I consider to be just underneath that big three, Chucky. And what is the reason for that? I mean, the filmmakers followed the tried and true formula that made all of those characters great. They gave a lot of the similar elements like urban legends, one-liners, awesome kills, iconic weapons, the pain and the torture and the realm of the Djinn, all of those things that we've seen and that we crave as horror fans, but for some reason it was diminishing returns this time around. Some would say that the stories, the direction, just the overall execution of those movies just probably wasn't on par with some of the execution back in the 70s and 80s, and obviously that's why they're not quite of that iconic status of Jason, Michael, Freddy, or Chucky. But you know what? There's just as much of a valid argument to be made that a lot of the installments on those beloved franchises weren't really quite up to par as far as filmmaking standards themselves. So what's the answer then? Why is the Djinn, the Leprechaun, the Candyman, and Ben Willis not quite up on par, not as beloved, not as remembered and hailed to the level of Freddy, Michael, Jason, and Chucky? Well, here's my theory. While all those characters were experiencing their slow and unfortunate deaths in the late 80s into the early 90s, all of those iconic characters from the 70s and the 80s, while those characters were sleeping, they weren't actually resting. They were being recreated. That's right, people, believe it! These horror creators and horror writers and directors of the 1990s gave us the impression that they were giving us completely fresh and new ideas, completely fresh and new characters to take the mantle of the horror icon status while the horror icons of the 70s and 80s laid to rest. But subliminally, they were giving us exactly what we wanted.
Let this wonderful 80s classic soothe you. Just a nice, warm, happy time.
God damn, the power of suggestion is real. I've come here to chew bubblegum and watch horror movies. And I'm all out of bubblegum. You don't believe me? Think about it this way. What made Candyman iconic? Let's see, an urban legend that comes back and exacts vengeance upon anybody that comes across his territory. A pint-sized yet deadly killer whose main weapon of attack is his quick wit and one-liners. A demon in charge of his own realm trying to gather the souls of his victims. And a human character with an iconic look, a simple weapon, and an unrelenting thirst for blood. Hell, we've even had the comparison for years about how similar Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers are. What do you call that, people? But nonetheless, there's still a lot of fun and a lot of enjoyment to be had in these classic horror franchises of the 1990s. But have no fear, even if these franchises don't quite fill that void that was left and don't quite quench that thirst that was left by the death of the 70s and the 80s slashers. To quote a great man,
Eternal.
Welcome to Horror Needs a Hero, July 90s Slashers.